Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 8 in Legal Environment of Business International Law in a Global Economy. I'm just going to spend a very brief couple of minutes with you on this one. Hopefully, you have had or will be taking international business classes, and you'll get a lot of this material provided to you in much more detail, but did just want to hit a couple of highlights with you. When we talk about international law, and of course we'll spend the bulk of our course looking at national law, the laws, regulations, cases, and so forth of the United States. But again, we need to realize that we share this world with a number of other countries, civilization, cultures, and legal systems, and so it's important to at least have a passing familiarity with those. When we talk about international law, we're talking about the body of written and unwritten laws, including treaties, which are governmental frameworks, that govern the relations between and among nations and citizens of one or more sovereign states, and these include things like the General Convention, the Warsaw Convention, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, nuclear test ban, all those that you hear about in the news. Then, of course, there are national laws, and those are the laws that govern the rights and obligations of persons within a particular country. As we will see, not only in this chapter, but we saw in chapters dealing with ethics, and you'll continue to learn that oftentimes competing legal systems, competing bodies of law can create all sorts of business issues, ethical issues, and the like. The key questions raised by international law, which tend to be less present when looking at national law, are who are going to enforce the rights and obligations created by treaties when you have more than just one country involved, and how will they enforce those rights and obligations. And then we also have to understand that there are less formal relationships between countries that often play out, known as international customs, and those are practices that have evolved among nations in their relations with one another that may or may not be spelled out in a statutory or treaty framework. In looking at national law systems across the world, we generally find that there's a couple of general categories of those. There's what's known as the common law system, and that's very similar to what we have in the United States. Also, you can look at Great Britain and many of the colonies and possessions of Great Britain. And that recognizes the precedential value of prior judicial decisions, which provide binding and not merely persuasive authority to guide the decisions in subsequent disputes. So if you look at a common law system like the United States, the courts play a very important role in that courts hear and decide cases, and they write down decisions, and those decisions that are written down need to be followed in subsequent similar cases. We talked a little bit about that in the first couple of chapters, where we looked at this notion of stare decisis and precedent. And so the courts are very important in common law systems. Then we have what are known as civil law systems, and examples of those are Mexico, some of continental Europe, and South America, and those are based primarily on statutory or codified law. So if you're looking for the answer to a dispute, you kind of simply go to the books and see how the code would resolve that problem. And in cases like that, if you go to a court to have your dispute resolved, the court will resolve the dispute in just that decision, and it will not have any precedential value later on. So that can make litigation required, timely, and expensive. In terms of some general legal principles and doctrines that we look at in the area of international law, one is comity, which is not comedy as in ha ha ha, but comedy, or some people refer to it as comity, which is the willingness of one nation's deference to and willingness to enforce the laws and judicial decrees of another country, as long as those laws and decrees are consistent with fundamental laws and public policies of the deferring nation. So what happens if we end up in some sort of treaty relationship or business relationship, country to country, with another country that practices human rights violations, that doesn't have freedom of the press, and again, you just need to look in the news to see these kinds of relationships that exist. Generally, we will pay deference to laws of other countries that are consistent with ours, and not those that are inconsistent with those. Another legal principle and doctrine that you need to understand is what's known as the active state doctrine. And the active state doctrine is a judicially created doctrine by which the courts of one country will not examine the validity of government acts committed by another country within that latter's territory. So, what do we do if we have a situation where one government within its territory is again violating civil rights, human rights of people? Under the state of active state doctrine, we would not get involved in that. There's also what's known as sovereign immunity, and this is the idea that foreign nations are exempt from the jurisdiction of U.S. courts subject to certain limitations set forth in the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which we don't have time to talk about. But, think about the idea that a foreign national would come to the United States under some sort of diplomatic immunity, commit a crime, kill somebody, and that kind of thing. Generally, we are not going to have jurisdiction over that individual. We're not going to have jurisdiction over other foreign country activities under the sovereign immunity doctrine. All right, you don't really need to know too much about the international business practices other than what you read in the text. I'm going to skip through regulating international trade. I told you we'd go through this pretty quickly. Again, because I think that you'll get a lot of this in subsequent international business classes, and we simply don't have the time resources to cover all of this stuff as well as we need to. So just be familiar with these slides. Know a little bit, again, about the fact that oftentimes conflicts are going to occur between U.S. laws and federal laws, or I'm sorry, U.S. laws and foreign laws, and trying to figure out how those work can be problematic oftentimes. So as I told you, a very brief discussion. We're going to move in next unit into talking about things like contracts and that good stuff. So we'll visit with you then. Take care.